I was lying in bed half awake, the room lit only by the soft glow of the TV sitting on the dresser. I wasn't even watching it anymore. Some crime show was playing, the kind with dark streets and grainy camera footage, but I was too tired to focus on anything except the small comfort of noise filling the room. It was almost 2 in the morning, and my fiancé was still at work. I hated nights when he worked late, because the house always felt different when I was alone. Maybe it was the neighborhood, maybe it was the silence, maybe it was just the fact that I never fully relaxed when he wasn't home. I kept telling myself that the house was ours now, that we had chosen it, that the price was too good to pass up. But in moments like that, lying there in the dark, I could feel every decision we made pressing right back down on me. I was starting to drift off when I heard it. A faint scratch at first, like something lightly dragging across the outside of the bedroom wall. I didn't react at first because honestly, the house made weird noises all the time, and the yard had enough trees and dried branches that anything could rustle or scrape against something. Then the scratching moved closer, right under the window. The window that sat barely a foot from my face when I lay on that side of the bed. I remember staring at the curtain and thinking it was probably just a squirrel or something climbing on the siding. We had a few that liked to run the fence line in the mornings, so it wasn't a stretch. But then the scratching changed. It grew slower, more deliberate, like something trying to get a grip. I could hear claws or nails catching on the wood frame. It was so close that I could feel the vibration through the wall. I was still trying to rationalize everything until I heard something that didn't match any animal sound I knew. Low mumbling. Harsh little curses. Words, actual words, coming from outside the glass. They were slurred and messy, like someone trying to talk through a mouthful of spit. My entire body went cold in one instant. It was the kind of cold that didn't come from the room, but from something inside my chest that seemed to freeze solid. Before I could even decide what to do, a new sound started. The soft metal scrape of something thin prying under the window frame. Slow, steady pressure lifting up on it. I knew that sound. I had installed the screens myself when we moved in. I remembered the way the screwdriver felt when I had to lift the frame. The noise was identical. Someone was trying to get into the bedroom. The fear hit me so fast and so hard that I didn't even think. My voice came out raw and loud. I screamed that I had a gun and that I was calling the police. I didn't think about what I was saying, didn't think about how my voice shook or cracked. I just screamed as hard as I could. The scraping stopped immediately. I didn't hear footsteps or rustling or running. It was just gone, like the person outside had turned to smoke. My hands were shaking so badly that the phone almost slipped out of them when I dialed 911. I could barely get the words out. I stayed crouched behind the bed frame until the dispatcher told me the officers were pulling up. When the cops knocked, I almost didn't go to the door. My legs felt weak and thick, like I had to drag them across the floor. They came inside, did a full check of the yard with their flashlights, looked around the bedroom window. Nothing. Not even footprints. One of them even knelt down and ran his hand across the dirt, trying to see if anything was disturbed. He didn't find a single thing. I felt stupid and small standing there, trembling in my own living room while they walked back toward the driveway. I thanked them even though my voice barely came out. In the back of my head, I kept thinking how ridiculous I must have looked, how they probably got calls like this from people in this neighborhood all the time. Maybe they thought I imagined it. Maybe they thought I heard the TV and freaked myself out. I tried to shut the door casually, like I wasn't falling apart inside. Then all their radios went off at once. Every officer turned at the same time, listening to the static and the voice coming through about another reported break-in just a few blocks away. They didn't even look back at me. They ran straight to their cars, doors slamming, engines roaring. In seconds, they were gone. I locked the door again, checking it twice. My hands were still shaking. It felt like the house actually got darker after they left, even though the same lights were on. I walked back into the bedroom like every shadow was watching me. I sat on the bed with my back pressed against the headboard and kept the TV playing just for sound. I wasn't tired anymore. I just wanted my fiancé home. He called on his way, and hearing his voice helped a little, but not enough to calm the pounding in my chest. He told me to stay on the phone until he got home, and I clung to that call like it was oxygen. I kept my eyes on the hallway, the bedroom door, the shadow in the corner where the lamp didn't reach. Every few seconds I checked the window without actually getting close to it. Then I heard something outside again. Not a scratch this time, but a slow, heavy thud like weight landing on wood. Our shed had a ramp built onto it, so the previous owners could push yard equipment inside. The sound came from that exact ramp. The same slow, heavy footstep. Then another. Someone walking up it. I thought it was him. I thought maybe he came through the back to check the yard. Without thinking, I said that he was home and hung up the phone. I walked straight toward the back door, not even scared for a second, because I believed completely that it had to be him. My phone rang immediately. I answered, confused. He told me he wasn't anywhere near the house yet. My fear didn't come back in a slow wave. It hit like something slamming both hands into my chest. I felt air rush out of me, and the room spun. I couldn't move at first. I just stared at the back door like something on the other side could hear my heart pounding. When I finally got my limbs to work, I backed away, grabbed the phone tighter, and dialed 911 again with fingers that barely obeyed me. The police and my fiancée arrived at almost the exact same moment. They searched the yard again, making wide sweeps with flashlights, checking the shed, the ramp, the fence line. This time they weren't acting doubtful. They looked tense, like they already knew who it was. One officer told me they'd been getting calls all night. Someone in the area, some guy so strung out he could barely walk straight, had been going house to house trying to pry windows open with a screwdriver. They had been trying to catch him for hours. Every time they got close, he slipped between backyards or alleyways and ended up at another house. He had been one step ahead of them the entire night. When they checked the window where I first heard the scratching, one of the officers pointed at the frame. The screen was half pulled off. There was a big wasp nest that had been hidden behind it, thick and paper-like. It looked torn, broken open in spots, like something had shoved right into it. The wasps inside had been disturbed and had probably flown everywhere, which explained the strange cursing outside my window. Not squirrels, just a man swearing through a cloud of angry insects. I stood there staring at it, feeling sick. If that nest hadn't been there, the window might have come up all the way. The only thing between me and a desperate stranger was a bunch of furious insects defending their territory. The police stayed until everything settled. They promised they had cruisers circling the neighborhood and that they were closing in on the guy. They told me to keep the doors locked and to leave the porch light on. My fiancée didn't leave my side the rest of the night. When we finally went back to the bedroom, the broken screen was still crooked, the nest still hanging there like some kind of accidental warning. The ending came the next morning, when the police called to say they caught the guy behind an abandoned house a few blocks away. He still had the screwdriver in his pocket. He admitted he had been trying random windows all night, trying to get inside anywhere that looked dark or quiet. Ours had been one of them. Finding out he had been caught didn't erase the fear, but it closed the night in a way I needed. I could finally breathe knowing it wasn't some mystery, not some strange presence lurking unseen. It was exactly what it felt like, a desperate man in a bad neighborhood doing desperate things. And when I think back to that night now, I still remember the way the scratching sounded on the window, how close it was, how personal it felt. But I also remember the wasps, those angry little things doing what they do without even knowing it. They kept him from getting inside. They kept me from facing something far worse than fear. Those angry insects, in the end, were the reason I'm still here to even tell the story. I was renting a house in a small, struggling old mining town in Appalachia, the kind of place where the houses sagged a little on their foundations, where the paint peeled in wide flakes, where people mostly kept to themselves because everyone had their own problems. The town sat in a valley surrounded by long, quiet ridges, and when the wind moved through them at night it felt like the whole place was a little disconnected from the rest of the world. I lived alone, which I usually liked, even though the house was old and the nights were dead silent except for the occasional train echoing through the hills or the sound of dogs barking at nothing. The inside of the house always felt a little too dark no matter how many lamps I turned on. The floors creaked when I walked, and the front door, which was old wood with a cheap deadbolt, didn't feel as solid as I wanted it to. On one of the first warm nights of spring, I went to bed with the windows cracked for the first time in months. The air smelled like wet soil and blooming trees, and for once I felt relaxed instead of tense. Around 4 in the morning, I woke up fast and fully alert with that sudden heavy feeling in my chest that something wasn't right. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it, the sound of my front doorknob turning. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, a soft metallic clicking that didn't stop. At first I thought maybe someone was confused, maybe someone who lived nearby was drunk or got the houses mixed up in the dark. That happens sometimes in towns like that, but the turning didn't stop. It kept going, slow and persistent, like the person on the other side was patient enough to keep testing it until something happened. I didn't have a peephole or a window near the door, so I couldn't see who it was. The only way to check would have been to open the door, and that wasn't going to happen. I stood a few feet back and yelled, trying to sound awake and steady. Right after I spoke, the doorknob stopped, but only for a second. Then the whole door started to shake like someone had grabbed it with both hands and was trying to rip it open. Heavy hits thudded against the wood, and each one made the frame vibrate. I tried again louder, hoping the person would at least realize they had the wrong house. Instead, the person made this low growling noise, not like an animal but like a human who wasn't thinking clearly, like someone trapped in some kind of rage they couldn't pull themselves out of. The sound rolled through the wood and made the air inside the house feel tighter. I backed away and went into the kitchen, grabbed the closest thing I had that resembled a weapon, a long kitchen knife, and then hurried into the living room where I had my phone. I called the police with shaking hands, forced myself to speak clearly, then sat in the dark with the knife in my lap while the door continued to rattle off and on like the intruder was trying to catch me off guard. After about 10 minutes, everything stopped. I heard a knock. I opened the door only an inch, saw a police officer standing there with his flashlight angled down. He asked me a few questions through the small gap, then told me to close the door and stay inside while they checked around the outside of the house. I shut it, locked it again even though it felt like that old lock meant nothing, then turned off every light and stood in the middle of the room, trying not to breathe too loudly. For about 20 minutes, there wasn't a single sound. The night outside was heavy and still. I kept picturing someone crouched underneath the front steps, waiting. I kept thinking about how thin the walls of the house were, how anyone with enough force could probably break in if they wanted to. I gripped the knife so hard my hand hurt, and I tried to listen for anything, footsteps, voices, something, but the silence pressed down like a weight on my ears. Then something happened so fast it felt unreal. The window on the far side of the living room, the one with the loose old screen I kept meaning to fix, made this soft scraping sound, like something pushing from the outside. I turned toward it and saw the bottom edge of the screen bending forward, almost folding into the room. Then the curtain moved, pushing in toward the lamp on the table. Someone was pressing the screen out of the way and trying to climb in. I could hear their breathing against the glass, uneven and rough. My heart shot right up into my throat. I lifted the knife with both hands and yelled as loud as I could, trying to sound like the kind of person who wouldn't hesitate to use it. Before I could figure out what the person outside was doing next, a voice boomed through the night, right outside the window, ordering the intruder to get on the ground. The sound was harsh and sharp, and I could hear movement, fast, chaotic movement, followed by another noise that didn't sound human. It was this long, broken wail that cracked halfway through, like the man trying to break and didn't have full control of his own voice. Then the sounds of a struggle, feet shuffling, someone hitting the ground hard. After that, everything went quiet again except for the officers' voices commanding him to stay down. A few minutes later, there was another knock. I opened the door and saw the same officer from before. His uniform was clean, but he looked shaken in a way that made me uneasy. His face was pale and tight, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he didn't want to look at whatever was happening behind him. He told me they had the man in custody and that I was safe for the night. I nodded, but the look in his eyes scared me almost as much as the intruder had. He seemed rattled in a deep way, like whatever he'd just dealt with wasn't something he expected to see in a town that was usually more sad than dangerous. The next day, I went out to get groceries and ended up running into the same officer at the small gas station on the edge of town. He recognized me immediately. His face had color again, but he still looked tired, like he hadn't slept well. He told me the man they arrested wouldn't give them real information, that he kept calling himself Jason Voorhees, repeating it like he believed it. The officer shook his head and said they were treating it like a drug issue, that the guy probably wasn't from the town or had wandered in during a high. He didn't go into detail about what the man looked like or what shape he was in, and I didn't ask. I could already tell it was something the officer didn't want to think about. For the rest of the week, I kept the windows closed and locked, even though the weather was warm. I bought a new deadbolt, the kind that looked like it could survive an earthquake, and installed it myself. Every noise at night made me freeze. Even the distant sound of cars on the main road felt suspicious. I realized how alone I really was out there, how thin the walls were, how close I had come to waking up with someone inside my home. I kept replaying the sound of the screen being pushed in. The way the curtain moved like a hand was underneath it. But the part that lingered with me the longest wasn't the breaking in, or the growling, or the shaking door. It was the officer's face. The way a trained, uniformed cop looked pale and shaky while telling me I was safe. The way he said the intruder's name like it was something he didn't want to repeat again. The way he avoided describing the man at all. It made me understand something I hadn't thought about before. Sometimes the scariest people aren't the ones who sneak around quietly or try to be clever. Sometimes they're the ones who have completely lost touch with reality, who don't feel fear or hesitation or reason, who act without any pattern you can predict. People pushed to the edge by drugs or pain or whatever life had done to them can be more dangerous than anything fictional. I moved out a month later. I didn't have an exact plan of where to go next, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house. Every time I walked past the living room window, I saw the bent frame where the screen had been forced in. Every time I passed the front door, I imagined the knob turning and the door shaking again. I realized I didn't want to live alone anymore, not in that kind of town. Not in a place where the silence left too much room for thoughts like that. Leaving didn't feel like running away. It felt like taking back the part of myself that night had taken. I packed slowly, cleaned the house one last time, and locked the door behind me with the new deadbolt I had installed. And when I drove out of that valley, watching the ridges rise and fall behind me, I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in weeks. The fear didn't disappear completely, but at least I wasn't sleeping in a place where reality had cracked open just enough to let someone like that in. That was enough for me. Over this past summer, I was living alone in my small apartment in a college town. It wasn't the biggest place, just a one-bedroom with a tiny kitchen and a bathroom that barely fit a person comfortably, but it was mine, and I liked that. I had moved in right after the semester ended, so the streets were quiet, and most of my neighbors were either gone for the summer or mostly kept to themselves. Even though it was considered a relatively safe area, I always had this constant edge of paranoia. I was careful with doors, windows, and locks, always double-checking that everything was secure whenever I came home. Being a female living alone made me even more alert, and over time, it became a habit, one I was very conscious of. The apartment itself was quiet, too quiet sometimes. It had one main window in the living room that looked out onto the street, letting in morning light that made the space feel warmer. But it also meant I could see if anyone was lingering outside. I liked that view. It made me feel a little safer. My bedroom was in the back of the apartment, separated from the living room by a short hallway, with the bathroom at the very end. Most nights, I would leave the front door locked, sometimes even putting the deadbolt on twice, just to be certain. It wasn't like I had experienced any serious threats, but the news, my friends' stories, and general caution kept me on edge. One morning, I woke up just before the sun had fully risen. My sleep was light, and I felt groggy and sticky from the warm summer air. I rolled over, checked my phone for the time, and then decided I should go to the bathroom before starting my day. The hallway was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I stepped into the bathroom, the tiles cold beneath my bare feet, and leaned over the sink, still half asleep. Then I heard it, a sound that made my chest tighten immediately. It was a creak, the unmistakable sound of the front door moving. At first, I froze. My mind scrambled, trying to rationalize it, but the sound had come from the front door, and that meant someone was in my apartment. I stayed as still as I could, my heart hammering, my ears straining for the next sound. Then I realized I was in the bathroom, with the door closed behind me. The small space felt confining, almost claustrophobic, and my breath came fast. I carefully stepped out, trying not to make any noise, and peeked around the corner toward the living room. My eyes immediately went to the front door, and there it was, open about 6 inches, just enough to see the thin strip of light from the hallway outside. The door was supposed to be locked. It had been locked before I went to bed. I hadn't even taken my keys out yet, and there was no one supposed to be coming in this early. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move slowly and quietly as I checked the apartment. The living room was empty. The couch, the small coffee table, the lamp in the corner, everything was as I had left it. The kitchen showed no signs of disturbance. I crept through each room, scanning every corner, every shadow, my eyes wide, my hands trembling slightly. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had been touched. I even checked the bedroom again, looking under the bed and behind the dresser. The apartment was empty. I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it must have been the wind. That made sense. The weather forecast had mentioned mild breezes overnight. Maybe the wind had somehow nudged the door open while I was sleeping. But even as I repeated the explanation in my mind, it didn't fully convince me. The door had a solid frame, and the latch was meant to keep it closed unless pulled hard. Yet there it was, slightly open, letting a strip of light from the hallway into my otherwise dark apartment. I decided then that I needed to be prepared for the rest of the time I was alone in the apartment. I went to the drawer in my bedroom where I kept a small folding knife, the kind you could carry for emergencies. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple blade, but the weight in my hand gave me a strange sense of control. I set it on my nightstand, right within reach of the bed, and made a mental note to keep it there whenever I was alone. I went through the apartment one more time, checking locks, sliding the deadbolt back and forth, making sure the windows were secure. Everything clicked into place, and I felt a little safer, though the tension in my shoulders didn't fully leave. The rest of the morning passed slowly. I stayed alert, hearing every small noise, the creak of the floorboards, the faint buzz of the refrigerator, the soft whistle of air through the vents. Every sound made me tense, made me glance at the door, knife in hand. Even simple tasks, like making coffee or folding laundry, felt weighted with caution. I moved carefully, keeping my senses sharp, always aware of the front door. After that morning, I never left the apartment feeling careless. I made it a habit to double-check the door, even if I had just locked it a minute before. The knife stayed on my nightstand, and sometimes late at night, I would lie awake, listening for any sign that something was out of place. It wasn't a fear that consumed me entirely, but it was always there, a reminder to stay vigilant. Weeks passed without incident. Nothing unusual happened again, and gradually, I began to feel a little more comfortable. I realized that living alone required a kind of constant awareness, a balance between being cautious and not letting paranoia take over. I learned to trust my instincts while also acknowledging when they might be overactive. The incident with the door became a story I told myself silently, a lesson in preparedness. By the end of the summer, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. I had managed to live alone, take care of myself, and handle the fear that came with those first few nights. The apartment, once tense with the memory of that morning, felt more secure. The knife remained nearby, a simple precaution, and I knew that if anything ever happened again, I would be ready. Living alone had taught me a kind of strength I hadn't known I had before. And though I never found out exactly why the door had opened that morning, I knew that vigilance and preparedness were the best protection I had. I felt stronger, more aware, and more capable, and that clarity stayed with me long after that summer ended. I remember that night clearly, even though it was years ago. My parents had converted our garage into a massive extra bedroom, the kind of place that was supposed to be for hanging out, playing games, and doing whatever we wanted. By the time I was 10, it was already a bit cluttered, filled with old boxes, random furniture, and other junk that had been shoved aside over the years, but it was still my favorite room to hang out in. My siblings were all away that night. One had a sleepover, another was at a friend's house, and it was only the second or third time I had been left completely alone. I was excited. I had the whole place to myself. I could play our PS2 as long as I wanted, and I had no one around to complain about the noise or tell me to go to bed. I spent the evening fully immersed in a game, completely losing track of time. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, and the glow from the TV and the PS2 filled the space with flickering colors. I remember leaning back on the old couch, my legs stretched out, completely focused on what was happening on the screen. The sound of explosions, gunfire, and characters talking in the game was almost deafening in the quiet of the house, and I felt a kind of freedom I never had when anyone else was around. The hours passed, and I didn't even notice it getting late. It must have been deep into the night because the house was silent, the kind of silence where even the ticking of the clock sounded loud. That's when I first heard it, a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was part of the game, maybe the sound of someone knocking or a repetitive noise effect, so I didn't pay much attention. But the tapping continued, slow at first and then picking up speed. It was steady, like someone drumming their fingers on a hard surface. 1, 2, 3 for 1, 2, 3 for quick, relentless, repeating without pause. It didn't take me long to realize that the sound wasn't coming from the game. My stomach twisted in that sudden, sinking way when you know something is wrong. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a branch scratching against the outside of the house. But then the sound moved, and my heart leapt into my throat. The tapping shifted from the window to the front door, which had been part of the garage conversion. They had really gone all out with that remodel. Instead of the old garage door, they had installed a full wall with a large window and a proper front door, the kind you'd see in any house, complete with a bolt and doorknob locks. The doorknob rattled. My blood ran cold. Someone was outside. My first thought was that maybe it was a neighbor, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would be tapping so aggressively at our door at that hour. But the sound continued, and when I tiptoed closer to the door, I realized both locks were unlocked. That door always jammed, so even when it was unlocked, it felt like it was locked unless you put a lot of effort into it. I grabbed the bolt and the doorknob lock and locked both of them as loudly as I could, almost hoping the noise would signal to the person outside that the door wasn't going anywhere. A laugh came from outside, gruff and low, and my stomach dropped. It was a man's laugh, deep and mean, not friendly at all. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely touch the door without wanting to pull them back. The tapping started again, even faster, like he was trying to get my attention, trying to scare me. Then a voice came through the glass of the window, low, tired, and strange, calling in. "Let me in, love. I'm cold and hungry. Don't you want to be nice to your neighbor?" I didn't respond. I didn't move. I could feel my heart hammering so hard it might burst out of my chest. My mind raced, imagining all the possibilities, none of them good. I thought of my parents and my siblings, how far away they were. There was no one else in the house to protect me, and there was no way I could fight off a grown man. The fear was so sharp it felt physical, cutting into my chest, making my hands tremble uncontrollably. I turned off the light in the room. The PS2 screen went dark. The only sound now was my shallow, fast breathing. I didn't dare make a sound, barely dared to move. I crawled out of the big garage room slowly, feeling the floorboards creak beneath me, and ran to my own bedroom at the other end of the house. I locked my door as best I could, though the old lock was flimsy. I pulled the blanket over my head, the darkness pressing in around me like a shield. Every sound outside made me freeze, convinced he was just a step away. The tapping returned occasionally, muffled now by the distance, and every time I heard it my stomach dropped like I was falling. I didn't sleep. I stayed under that blanket, trembling and listening to the house creak in the wind, waiting for morning. I kept imagining him standing outside my window, peering in, maybe trying to find another way in. My mind replayed the laugh over and over, imagining the roughness of his hands, the way he sounded like he was used to getting what he wanted. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't locked the door, if I hadn't turned off the light. Hours passed. I can't say exactly how many. The house began to wake up with the early morning sun. Birds started singing outside, the world felt normal again, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of the car pulling into the driveway. My parents were home. The weight of relief hit me all at once, and I climbed out from under the blanket, still shaking but safe. I didn't tell them what had happened. At 10 years old, I was more afraid of getting in trouble for staying up than anything else. Even now, years later, I remember the way the light turned from the lamp in the big room, the way the shadows moved across the walls, and that laugh outside the door. I remember the taps at the window, slow and steady, and the gruff voice asking to be let in. I never stayed alone in that house after that night, and I always triple-checked the locks whenever I was anywhere by myself. I know it was probably just a homeless man looking for food and shelter, but the fear I felt wasn't about ghosts or stories. It was real. Someone could have gotten inside, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. That night taught me how fragile safety can be, and how careful you have to be, even in your own home. The locks, the doors, the little precautions, they aren't just rules. They're the difference between a normal night and something that could have gone horribly wrong. I never forgot it, and even now, whenever I hear tapping on a window at night, I check the locks. I make sure everything is secure, because I know how fast a quiet, ordinary night can turn into something frighteningly real. That night didn't involve monsters or anything unreal. It was just a man, a house, and me, and it was enough to make 10-year-old me understand fear in the clearest, rawest way. By the time my parents came home, I was exhausted, drained, but alive. And that's the ending. I survived by being careful, by locking the door, by staying hidden until the danger passed. It was real, it was terrifying, and it left me with a lesson I've carried ever since. I was 14, home alone for the first time in my life, and it felt like I had finally won some sort of small personal lottery. My parents had gone to pick up my grandparents from the airport, something they never did without at least one of us being home. My older brother was out at a party, which meant the house was completely empty except for me, my PlayStation, and the pizza I had just ordered. It was past midnight, the house was quiet, and the warm, greasy smell of pepperoni filled the living room. I settled into the couch, headset on, controller in hand, ready to get lost in a late-night gaming session with my best friend. It was the perfect setup, or so I thought. We were deep into a Call of Duty match, shouting at each other through the headset, laughing, and arguing over who had the better kill streaks. Time slipped away, and before I realized it, it was around 2 in the morning. That's when it happened. I heard the faint buzz of the doorbell. At first, I thought it was my parents. Maybe they had arrived back early, or forgot something in the car. A small wave of relief washed over me, and I started to get up to answer the door. But something didn't feel right. I froze halfway to the door, a sudden tightness in my chest. My stomach flipped as an uneasy feeling spread through me. I couldn't explain it, just a gut instinct warning me that something was wrong. Then, before I could decide what to do, the quiet buzz turned into violent pounding. The door shook with every hit, and I heard a man's voice, loud and frantic, screaming to be let in. I froze. My hands felt numb, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Everything in me wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't move. After a moment, I managed to pull myself together enough to grab the house phone. My fingers were shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but I managed to dial 000. The operator answered immediately, her calm voice in stark contrast to the chaos at my front door. I tried to explain as quickly and clearly as I could, my voice shaking, telling her there was a man trying to break into the house. At the same time, I remembered to call my parents. My brother was at a party, and I was terrified. I didn't want to be alone in this. My best friend on the headset could hear everything, the pounding, the shouting, my panicked breaths, but I hadn't been able to respond to his messages. I was juggling calling emergency services and my parents at the same time, my voice rising and falling as I explained the situation to both. After I hung up with my parents, the noise outside stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe he had gone, that maybe the danger had passed. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. As I continued to speak with the operator, giving my address and explaining the situation, a new sound broke the silence. It was loud, terrifying, like someone was trying to break a window. The man was back, even more aggressive than before, still screaming at the top of his lungs to be let in. I could hear him banging something against the glass, and the sound made my stomach turn. I was ready to accept that I might not be able to stop him, that I might have to face whatever was coming. But then a commotion erupted from the front of the house. My older brother, along with some of his friends, had arrived. They had heard the noise from the street, seen something strange, and came running. The man outside didn't have a chance. It turned out he had grabbed a small statue from the yard and was using it to try to smash the window. I still can't believe the glass didn't break under the force. My brother and his friends grabbed him, threw him down the stairs, and held him there until the police arrived. It was only after everything calmed down that I got the full story. The man was shirtless, clearly high on a hallucinogenic drug, and had apparently fled a party nearby after being caught doing something inappropriate. He had been wandering the streets, desperate and out of control, until he ended up at our house. Paramedics were called, and by the time they arrived, he was shivering uncontrollably. They told us that if he had been outside for even another hour, he could have died from hypothermia. My brother and I, along with his friends, had wrapped him in a blanket and given him warm water while waiting for help. The police asked if we wanted to press charges, but we declined. His parents arrived soon after, visibly shaken and apologetic, and they thanked us repeatedly for taking care of him until the paramedics arrived. They assured us that it was an isolated incident and that he would not bother us again. After that night, our house felt different. I was shaken, but I also felt a strange sense of confidence, knowing I had handled something terrifying. My parents and brother praised me for staying calm and doing everything right, even when I was scared out of my mind. The experience stayed with me for years, a reminder of how quickly a normal night can turn into a nightmare and how important it is to trust your instincts. Even now, thinking back, I can remember every detail. The smell of the pizza, the dark shapes of the furniture in the dim light, the pounding on the door, the scream of a man outside, the cold rush of fear that went through me when I realized I might be completely alone against someone who didn't care about anything but getting in. But I also remember the relief when my brother arrived, the calm voice of the operator on the phone, the warm blanket, and the fact that we did everything right and made it through. That night ended with the sirens fading in the distance, the man taken safely into care, and our house quiet again. I went to bed exhausted, trembling, but alive, and for the first time in my life, I truly understood how fragile safety can be, and how strong a 14-year-old can be when faced with something terrifying. I was 14, living in the suburbs of Australia back in the 70s, and for the first time, I was completely alone in the house. Mum and Dad had taken my siblings to some family gathering, something that had been going on for hours, and they had left me behind. It was a normal enough arrangement. They always made sure I could handle the house on my own for a few hours. But this night was different. Something about the air felt heavier, and the house seemed too quiet, too empty. Out here, the streets ended in bushland, dark patches of trees stretching far beyond the back fence. The sky had gone fully dark, with just a thin sliver of moonlight creeping through the edges of the curtains, casting soft silver shadows across the walls. I was sitting on my bed with a stack of books beside me, reading, feeling calm and comfortable. My lamp cast a circle of warm light, and the rest of the room was a dull, muted shadow. For a while, I was completely absorbed in the story, turning pages, flipping them over slowly, so I wouldn't rip the thin paper, letting myself sink into another world. Then I heard it. At first, it was subtle, just a faint shift in the atmosphere, like a soft scuffle of movement. I thought maybe it was the wind brushing against the eaves, or a possum outside the window. But then it became a little louder, a tiny scrape, then a whisper of sound from inside the house itself. My heart jumped, my eyes darted around the room. The lamp light seemed harsh all of a sudden, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. My good mood vanished instantly. It was just a moment ago I was content, feeling safe, and now everything felt wrong. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy, almost watching. I put my book down as quietly as I could, careful not to let it thump against the bed frame. Every small noise felt magnified. I crept to the door, moving slowly on the balls of my feet. The door creaked a little as I opened it, and I froze, holding my breath for a moment, afraid my parents had been replaced by strangers who had already entered the house. I told myself I was imagining it, that the house was just settling. But the sound was definitely real. It came from somewhere deeper inside, moving, shifting, and it wasn't random. The hallway stretched before me, long and narrow, the wooden floorboards faintly creaking under my weight. I could hear it more clearly now. The sound was coming from the kitchen at the far end, but moving through the living room meant I had to cross the main space of the house. The walls felt closer. Shadows flickered in the corners of my eyes. My stomach twisted. My hands were clammy, but I forced them to stay at my sides, not brushing against the wall too loudly, not knocking anything over. I started moving, slow steps, careful, almost crawling in a sense, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness of the hall. As I got closer to the living room, the noise became sharper, more defined. It wasn't random. It was voices, low, murmured, almost angry, as if two people were arguing. My stomach dropped into my feet. My first thought was robbers. We didn't have much of value in the house, but my parents kept some cash hidden, and there was a small amount of jewelry. Maybe they'd come in. Maybe they were waiting for an opportunity to take everything. My mind raced with possibilities. I stopped for what felt like an eternity in the middle of the hall, trying to steady myself. Every nerve in my body felt tense. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining to make sense of the whispers. I edged toward the corner of the living room, every muscle coiled, ready to flee or scream. The shadows from the lamp stretched along the walls and ceiling, and the air seemed thick, almost stifling. The voices continued, now clearer, carrying fragments of words I couldn't fully catch. My skin crawled. I had never been so frightened in my life. For 5 minutes, I stood stock still, debating what to do next. I told myself I couldn't stay frozen here. I had to know what it was. I had to face it, even though every instinct in me screamed to run to my room, lock the door, and hide under the covers until my parents came home. I crept closer, leaning forward slowly, inch by inch. My mouth was slightly open, my breath caught halfway, afraid that even a small puff of air might give me away. I reached the corner and peered just slightly, one eye barely visible, trying to glimpse the kitchen without exposing myself fully. And when I looked, the kitchen was empty. No one there. My heart slammed against my ribs, louder than ever. I could still hear the voices. They were louder, more urgent. I froze again, confused and terrified. How could two people be arguing in the kitchen when the kitchen was empty? I told myself firmly, this isn't ghosts, this isn't some story. I didn't believe in anything like that, but my mind raced for explanations. I forced myself to move again, telling myself I had to get closer. If I didn't, I'd never sleep tonight, never feel safe in this house again. Slowly, I edged into the kitchen, staying on my toes, careful not to make a sound. The voices were clearer now. They weren't harsh or aggressive. They had a rhythm, a pattern. I leaned closer, and my eyes fell on the stove. In those days, stoves were different. The burners had metal coils that sat above small electrical plugs. I bent down, almost laying my ear against one of the coils, and suddenly everything clicked. The voices were coming from the stove itself. Inside, through the metal, some strange phenomenon allowed the radio to be faintly heard. It was a radio show, two people talking, debating something completely ordinary. Relief washed over me in waves. I sat back on my heels, feeling the tension drain from my body in long shudders. The fear that had gripped me so tightly for the last hour was gone, replaced by a slow, lingering embarrassment at how scared I had been. I stayed there for a long while, just listening, making sure the voices were harmless, allowing the realization to sink in. By the time my parents and siblings returned, the night had stretched far beyond what I had expected. I showed them what had frightened me, letting them see how, if you pressed your ear close to the stove, the faint, tinny sound of a radio talk show could be heard. They laughed, a little, shaking their heads at my horror over something so mundane, but I couldn't help but feel the memory of the fear linger. Even now, decades later, I can remember the exact feeling of that night. The oppressive quiet, the shadows crawling along the walls, the unsteady heartbeat in my chest, and the sheer certainty that something was wrong in the house. I remember the tension, how every small creak made me jump, and the way the house had seemed alive, waiting for something. It was a fear like no other I have ever experienced, and it stayed with me for years afterward, resurfacing in moments of silence, reminding me that the mind can turn ordinary things into terror when you're alone and vulnerable. But the ending, the clarity that the voices were harmless, grounded me. I learned that sometimes the things that frighten you most aren't monsters or intruders. They're just ordinary things, ordinary sounds, magnified by your imagination in the dark. That night, I understood the weight of being alone, the way fear can twist reality, and the relief of finally discovering the truth, plain and simple. It was a lesson in both fear and perspective, and one I never forgot. I spent the summer at my parents' house, which is out in the kind of area where the nearest neighbor is more than half a mile away, and everything feels quieter than it should. Their place is big and old, with wide wooden floors that creak underfoot and long hallways that seem to stretch forever when the sun goes down. They have two huge, long-haired cats, brothers, both fluffy and solid, the kind of cats you can't just pick up and cuddle easily, but they have personalities that fill a room. Everyone in the house knows their quirks. They have a cat flap in the back door that only opens for the boys, using a little chip in their collars, so no other animals should be able to get in. At least, that's what we all assumed. My dad started mentioning something strange a few weeks into the summer. He said he thought another cat was sneaking in at night, because sometimes he would wake up and notice that the food the boys had been left with overnight was completely gone. The boys, who usually take their time eating, would be practically ravenous in the mornings. Of course, my dad knew no other cat should be able to use the flap, but still, he swore he had noticed the signs. At first, it seemed like an easy thing to explain away. Maybe the boys were just finishing their meals faster than usual. Or maybe one of them had learned to push their luck and knock the food bowl over while my parents weren't watching. We didn't think much of it, but a strange unease began creeping into the house. You could feel it in the quiet, the way shadows lingered differently at night, the way the cats sometimes froze for a moment, staring at nothing. Then one night, my dad got up to use the bathroom. The house was dark, the hallway dimly lit by the faint glow from outside coming through the windows. He saw a cat on the landing, sitting there like it belonged, staring back at him. Without thinking much, he called, "Hello, Charlie," thinking it was one of the boys, and the cat didn't react except to blink slowly. My dad went back to bed, shaking his head at how quiet it had been, telling himself that maybe he had just been half asleep and imagined things. When he climbed back under the covers, curled up at the foot of the bed was Charlie, the real Charlie, fast asleep, purring quietly. My dad stared at him for a moment, utterly confused, and eventually decided he must have imagined the other cat entirely. A few days later, my mum was in the garden, tidying up flower beds and checking the herbs she had planted near the kitchen window. Charlie, who usually had a very reserved attitude toward the garden, was following her everywhere, brushing against her legs, rubbing under her hands, unusually affectionate. It struck her as odd because he normally just sat in the sun and preened himself while keeping a careful eye on things from a distance. When she finally decided to go back inside, she opened the kitchen door and let Charlie in with her. She turned around, and there, sitting in the kitchen looking at her, was another cat. Identical. Same long fur, same markings, same size. She froze. Both of them looked like twins. At first, it was hard to believe. My mom checked their collars to make sure she wasn't seeing things, but only one collar had the chip for the cat flap. The other cat didn't have a collar at all. My parents named him Doppy, though he didn't belong to anyone we knew. He was a stray, or at least he seemed to be. What was frightening wasn't just that he looked like Charlie. It was how seamlessly he had been moving around the house without anyone noticing. Over the next few nights, the pattern became clearer. Doppy would meow quietly at the cat flap outside. The boys, curious, would approach, and their collars would trigger the flap to open. The second Charlie, or Doppy, would slip inside in the seconds before the flap closed. He had been in and out of the house, eating meals, napping in sunny spots, using the litter boxes, and no one had ever caught him in the act. It was unsettling to watch, even knowing that the boys were completely unconcerned. They didn't hiss at him or seem stressed by his presence. It was as if they didn't even notice the intrusion. My mom tried taking photos, carefully documenting Doppy's features to post in local lost and found cat groups, but no one came forward to claim him. He didn't have a microchip, and there were no reports of missing cats that matched his appearance. My parents started to realize they had been living with a perfect double of Charlie for weeks without realizing it. Seeing Doppy up close made the reality hit. He was indistinguishable from Charlie. Same long fur, same thick ruff around the neck, same soft but intense green eyes. When he moved, he had the same lazy elegance, the same slow, deliberate steps. He even purred the same way. I had a cat of my own, and I couldn't imagine how anyone could mistake a double so convincingly. Yet my parents had. I watched him curl up in a sunny corner while the real Charlie sat nearby, and I realized how easy it would have been for them to eat the food, nap on the same rugs, move from room to room, and leave no sign of another animal ever being there. It was eerie at first. Every time one of the boys went to their food, I would watch closely, wondering which Charlie was which. Sometimes, when they were both lying in the sunbeam on the living room floor, I had to check their collars to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The way Doppy had learned to navigate the house quietly, to slip past unnoticed, made me tense. It was like living with a ghost that ate kibble. I caught myself double-checking rooms, peeking under tables, making sure there wasn't another identical cat sitting somewhere out of sight. After a while, though, the tension faded. Doppy was just a cat, a quiet, harmless visitor, and the boys didn't seem to mind him at all. My parents adapted quickly, keeping a closer eye on food bowls and making sure the flaps were closed at night. They kept Doppy out of some rooms and let him explore others, and he became a part of the household routine in a strange, silent way. The boys still got their meals, and Doppy always managed to find his own, often sitting nearby, purring quietly, never aggressive, never alarming, just there. Eventually, my parents accepted that this would probably continue indefinitely. Doppy wasn't causing harm. He wasn't destructive. He had simply found a way to live in a house where he didn't belong, and it was fascinating to watch how he had tricked all of us for weeks. My parents posted the photos online, just in case anyone recognized him, but no one ever did. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't a danger, he just existed alongside the boys, perfectly blending in. By the time I left, the house felt the same in many ways, but now I knew the secret undercurrent. Two identical cats moving through the rooms, one official, one imposter, both calm, both unbothered by each other, both masters of the quiet intrusion. It wasn't supernatural. There were no ghosts, no magic, no fairy tale. Just an incredibly clever, determined cat who had learned to navigate a world he didn't officially belong to. And in the end, it became oddly comforting, watching them all coexist peacefully. The house remained quiet, the boys happy, and Doppy a permanent, silent, perfectly timed visitor, slipping in and out without drama, blending in, eating his meals, curling up in the sun, and letting the world continue, unaware of the almost impossible trick that had been pulled right under our noses. It was unsettling at first, but eventually it just felt normal.